How many of you guys wrote Ruby in your first engineering job? Like, hands. And how many people have interviewed, keep your hands up. And how many people have interviewed someone for what would become their first job here? Cool, it is super terrifying on both ends, right? I'm Rebecca Poulson, and this is the Junior Jump, and we're gonna talk about onboarding, and particularly onboarding new engineers. And I think that this conversation is particularly relevant for us to have here as Rubyists, because over the past several years, we've really become the welcome gate for a lot of people, including myself, into the programming community. Who I've become as an engineer is much more a result of the resources and opportunities I've had at my job than anything I did in preparation for landing that job. And it's a lot of responsibility for us as a community, because not only are we training the engineers that we have to work with, but it's very likely that we're onboarding engineers who will probably train future engineers. That guy is unpacking the nesting doll of every coworker you will ever have. Before I was an engineer, I was a bartender and a playwright, so I got pretty good at talking to people, like professionally. I'll be super awkward if we're in the elevator, but if I have a problem to solve, I really like to talk it out with other people. And so as I was putting together this talk, I talked to a lot of people who are currently in their first jobs, people who mentor and hire people in their first jobs, and then a lot of more senior engineers about what their onboarding experience was like. And one of the commonalities I noticed was that you can really structure an onboarding experience in terms of 3 Ps. And that's planning, projects, and pairing. And by pairing, I actually mean mentorship, but I figured you'd remember more if I alliterated. And the first P is planning. Spoiler alert, it's all planning. But I want to talk very specifically about planning, because then we get to talk about what was the most maddening part of my job search. And that was that everywhere I really wanted to work had never hired a candidate like me. And they all asked me some variation on this same question, which was, what do you need to succeed here? Like, don't do that. Like, no one can answer that question, not for their first job. You're the person who has experience coding in a production environment. You know what kind of resources are practical for your company. When you ask candidates this question, you're basically asking them to have psychic abilities. They don't have access to that information. What they do have access to is the self-awareness of how they learn best. And that is a totally valid question to ask. Because when you're hiring at the junior level, you're not just hiring for coding ability. You're hiring for how much fun that person is going to be to teach. And it's really hard when you're first starting out to know what resources are appropriate to ask for. I very nearly didn't put this slide in because it's very ugly, but then I remembered this morning that it's totally the point of my talk. So these are things that are valid for you to ask for and for you to offer. Conferences, we're here, yay. Conferences are awesome. If your company cannot pay for them, at least seeking them out is hard. Identifying those opportunities is difficult. Hosting meetups is also a great thing to consider, particularly if you are a shop that has a lot of senior engineers. If you have space, hosting meetups can provide a peer group for the juniors that you're trying to mentor. Books are great, and books can also be a great tool for providing structure to mentoring, like working through Pooter together is a really valid experience. And then there's FaceTime. So when I started, I was told to set up a 30-minute meeting with every single engineer on my team, which was a lot of time. And they each got to tell me whatever they wanted to tell me about, which was very different things. Like, someone gave me a rapid and kind of terrifying intro to our payment structure. Somebody just asked me how my day was going. It's a pretty crazy time investment, and it's not always practical, but it makes the entire experience of onboarding so much less intimidating, and you'll learn really surprising things that you don't even know that your coworkers want other people to know. And you should always empower people to ask to pair, and you should always ask to pair yourself. Also, this one I find kind of great. Time to not feel guilty about not doing project work. I came from bartending where everything is transaction-based, where it's like, while you are at your job, you are always specifically like doing the task that is the transaction that you're engaged in. And so it took me a really long time to get used to the idea that when you're not directly working on your product, that's not actually wasted time. I asked my supervisor early on for like an hour a week to just read about design patterns, and he told me to take an hour a day. And setting aside that dedicated time was really, really important. Transcriptions can also be a really great resource. It's difficult to listen to people talk above your head for a sustained amount of time, but there's a lot of value that can be retained from going back over those notes. And recaps are something that was really specific to me, but personally, when it comes down to like learning how you learn, I'm a writer. I have a secret shame Tumblr that I only use for documenting new things. It's not a formal blog by any means. I would never share it with anyone except for my colleagues, but it's a really great educational tool. And the second most important part of planning for junior engineers is getting your documentation game on point. Ask the guy who wrote it is not on point. You should generate a lot of paper in preparing for new engineers. And then after they get a little bit of experience, they should generate paper. And like, obviously you don't have to print things out like it's 1999, but document everything. And this is important not only for all the very good reasons that having a well-documented code base is important for everyone, but social reasons as well. When you're transitioning into a production environment, written documentation gives you something to do while you're waiting to be told what to do. It just helps you feel less awkward at work. And it also gives you the hope that if you can't find the answer, that it's still in something you haven't read. The second and maybe the most technically difficult part of preparing a new engineer is planning an appropriate first project. At one point, I was working on like some construction metaphor for this section, and I found this, and I live in Brooklyn, and I can't really drive, so it was like very, very impressive to me. All right, so you guys all know what a round to it is, right? It's super cheesy. My high school English teacher had a poster of this on her wall. But I think it's really helpful when it comes to thinking about how to assign work to new engineers. Assuming that you do have the resource to mentor your new engineer pretty closely for her first 30 days or so, her first project shouldn't necessarily be your easiest work. Maybe not even the easiest work that she does in her first 6 months. You're actually assigning work to a pair which hopefully includes one of your most senior engineers. That pair of engineers is around to it. Like, give them the work that you've always been meaning to get around to implementing, but that isn't so mission critical that it has to be done on a really quick turnaround. You're looking to strike a balance between exciting work the junior can do with the help of her mentor and really boring stuff that fosters independence. These people are actually counting rice. But a lot of things that seem tedious for someone with a year or 3 under her belt are pretty exciting for a new engineer. Don't feel guilty about assigning boring stuff as long as it's not the only thing your junior is doing. Not only do you get to outsource work that doesn't thrill you, but even if it is just objectively really dull, and we do some work that is occasionally boring, like productivity and the ability to contribute independently is incredibly empowering. It's particularly useful if these kinds of tasks involve interacting with a broad section of your product, because then they can serve to provide overview and context. And when we're talking about projects, it's important to talk about admin tools and how your admin tools can be a really great resource for finding new work for engineers. I really like this metaphor of the self-5 for making awesome gains by writing internal tools, because you get both the benefit of the education and you actually get to use your own product. A couple of days ago, I was talking to a friend who works at Etsy. Do any of you guys read the Etsy engineering blog? Yeah, it's awesome. I mean, they write PHP, but they still have valid things to say. And when I think of their engineering culture, I think of two things. And that is that they really have an outstanding commitment to mentoring new engineers, and that they build like everything from scratch. And I don't think those two things are unrelated, because internal facing tools are a great place to look for appropriate projects for junior devs. While having a packaged environment set up and ready to go allows people to really hit the ground running, when you build a lot of internal facing tools, you're really creating a sandbox for both the mentoring of new engineers and for more established devs to experiment. So, personally, my first project was building a tool to automate our posting of DMCA claims to Chilling Effects. Chilling Effects is a database that provides transparency and monitors the way that intellectual property law affects internet users. This is a ground to it job. I work at Kickstarter, and we have a lot of user-generated creative content, and we care very deeply about how copyright affects our creators. But this was a nice to have, not a need to have, and that's very cool. It was also a self-contained project that I got to own completely. I wasn't building on top of something. While I was interacting, obviously, with stuff that was already built, this was essentially my baby. And never doubt the impact of providing your new engineers with a story to tell about their work. It's very hard to explain string extraction to your great uncle. It's not hard to have a tool to point to and be able to say, I built that. So the final and probably the most important P is pairing, or coming up with a mentorship model that works given the resources you have. Who will transmit the values of your engineering team to your new developer? And while knowing about 6 p.m. requisite tuxedos is important, the most valuable thing a mentor can do is to lower the cost of asking questions. Most people who care about being good at something feel like they're failing at that thing almost all of the time. And communicating with people who know more than you is really the only way to get rid of that feeling. Even if your organization is just you and the person you're hiring, write it into your onboarding guide that every new engineer will be assigned a mentor and meet with that mentor once a week. Some people will take advantage of that resource more than others, but the ones who need it the most are the ones who would be least likely to ask for it. Making it explicit and default alleviates a lot of pressure for new engineers. So when you're ready to make an offer to a new engineer, your team needs to ask these 3 questions. That's, what kind of resources can we give this person? How can we best help them? And how can they help us help them? And the answer to the second 2 questions should be formalized in your documentation. So how many here didn't have a formal mentor at their first job? Did not have a formal mentor at their first job? That's super, super common. And I'm very lucky in that my first job was at a pretty established company that was actively choosing to prioritize helping someone start her career. But some organizations might not be in that position when they decide to invest in junior talent, and that's great. If the only resource you can offer a candidate is time to get up to speed, our community is full of really independent, self-motivated learners that can be totally great for. But make that investment of time explicit, and don't leave your new dev feeling like they're hanging. However, if you're in the opposite position and your team is an embarrassment of mentorship riches, you should look to U2. We can debate the musical merits of U2 all we want, but the structure of their public persona is a pretty great metaphor for a mentorship team. You do need a Bono. This is the explicit mentor you've assigned to your new engineer. Much like Bono is U2's explicit interface to the general public, this mentor is your new engineer's interface with all of the knowledge that you need them to acquire. Mentoring your new dev is part of this person's job, and it's important that they consent to be evaluated on that. This person meets with your new dev regularly during their early days on the job. And a big part of the Bono mentor's job is being the person who can answer that question without passing judgment. One of the most difficult parts of being a new developer is that you haven't really developed the level of discernment to know which parts of your code base are specific to your company and what you can actually obtain by Googling. It's the Bono's job to help the junior dev cultivate that ability. And so the second person on a mentorship team is the edge. The edge is super important, but it's not quite as public. And you might not get all that much face-to-face time with this person during your day-to-day. Your supervisor or maybe your mentor's mentor might fill this role, but people who are really great at handling this role are available to the new developer as an alternative perspective and are happy to provide help in the event that you've driven your primary mentor insane. Nobody knows who Larry Mullen is. I do because I Googled pictures of him last week, but I'm not going to tell you guys which of these guys is Larry Mullen. Being the Larry Mullen of a mentorship team is a thankless and incredibly important job. When you are Larry Mullen, you do not get mentioned in your junior developer speech at the Imaginary Engineering Grammys. A Larry Mullen is simply a colleague that doesn't roll her eyes when a junior dev asks questions. These roles don't have to be explicitly articulated. They don't even have to be the same person every day. Larry Mullen might have something in common with the junior dev, a project, a gender, a fondness for needle-felted woodland creatures, but it's not a prerequisite. You are never too inexperienced to be a Larry Mullen, and everyone in this room has the power to become Larry Mullen. And so to recap, first P is planning. Work with your new engineer to develop her onboarding plan. It's awesome to be ready to invest in helping someone launch a career in programming. Work with them to support that investment. Projects. Look at assigning work to give your new engineers as an opportunity. They are around to it. Give them projects with visible impact. Balance exciting supervised work with boring independent work. Pairing. Lower the cost of asking questions, formalize your Bonos, and empower yourself to be everybody's Larry Mullen. Thank you, guys.